The mist had not yet lifted from the surface of the moat. When the keeper arrived, he came the same way he always did, through the narrow service path along the eastern wall, boots still dark from the dew on the grass outside. The mountain rose above him in the gray light, its concrete ridges and carved stone faces catching no warmth yet from a sun still buried behind cloud. Somewhere up on the middle ledge, half hidden in the cluster of bodies that had gathered there for the night's residual heat, a small figure sat with its back to the wall. The keeper stopped at the base of the mountain and looked up. He had learned in the weeks since this animal came back from the treatment room that looking up was most of what the work required now. He raised one hand, not reaching, not signaling, only lifting it toward the animal the way you might lift a hand toward someone across a room to let them know you are there. The scream came before his arm was fully extended. It tore across the enclosure, short and absolute. And the animals on either side of the small monkey scattered upward along the rock face in a ripple of gray fur and loose gravel. The keeper lowered his arm. He stood with both hands at his sides and looked at the left wrist of the small monkey wrapped in a strip of medical textile. The fabric now yellowed at the edges and fraying where it had worn against the stone. The wound beneath it had been confirmed healed 6 weeks ago. The fabric served no medical function, but every time anyone reached toward it, the animal responded as though something essential was being taken, not the cloth itself, but whatever the cloth had come to mean. No one understood why, not yet. It had begun, as these things often do, not with a dramatic rescue, but with a quiet discovery. A patrol keeper finding the animal at the edge of the outer tree line, sitting very still in the way that injured animals sit, conserving everything. The wire of the trap had been there long enough to leave a ring of damaged tissue around the left wrist, and the animal had stopped using that hand, entirely holding the arm slightly elevated, the way a person carries an injury through a crowd. It was brought inside to the treatment room, a small space with a single overhead light and a metal examination table that was cold to the touch even in summer. And the work of cleaning and wrapping the wound began that first afternoon. The keeper in the light blue denim jacket stood near the door during those first sessions, not because he was required to, but because the animal's eyes tracked human figures the way frightened animals do assessing exits. And his presence in the peripheral frame seemed over time to reduce the speed of that tracking. The wrist was wrapped each morning and unwrapped each evening for inspection. A routine that imposed its own rhythm on the animal's days. A rhythm as regular and as shaping as weather. Each unwrapping came with the smell of antiseptic, the cold surface of the examination table, the quality of fluorescent light that the animal had no reference for outside of this room and what happened in it. Each rewrapping was the end of that. The fabric going back on meant the session was over, meant stillness would return, meant the hands would withdraw and the overhead light would continue humming, and nothing further would be asked. Over 4 weeks of daily sessions, the animal built a direct equation between those two states. Fabric off, danger near. Fabric on, danger past, and it built this equation. The way all living things build their deepest knowledge through the body's own record of what has repeatedly been true. By the 5th week, the inflammation had resolved and new tissue was forming cleanly at the wound margins. By the 6th week, the veterinarian pressed along the scar line with 2 fingers, felt nothing shift, and stepped back from the table with a small nod. The wound was healed. An assistant moved toward the wrist with a small pair of blunt scissors, and the monkey's entire body contracted before the scissors had crossed half the distance. A scream, then a lunge toward the far corner of the table. The injured arm tucked hard against the chest, both eyes fixed on the scissors with an attention so complete it emptied the room of everything else. The scissors were put down. The keeper from his place near the door watched the animal's chest slow. As the scissors left its field of vision, watched the grip on the table edge loosen 1 finger at a time until the hand lay flat against the metal surface, in something that was not calm, but was at least the absence of immediate terror. The animal was doing exactly what it had been shaped to do, and what it had been shaped to do no longer matched the world it was living in. The keeper made one decision that afternoon. Standing in the doorway with his hands in the pockets of the light blue denim jacket, he would not try again. Not yet. Not like this. 3 days later, a senior colleague arrived at the treatment room With a different approach, he had worked with post-trap injuries before, and believed not unreasonably that the most efficient path was a single swift removal, followed by immediate distraction, with food giving the animal no time to organize its fear response before the thing it feared was already done. The keeper watched from the doorway. The colleague moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had done difficult things cleanly many times. And for the first several seconds, it appeared he might be right. The animal tracked him, but did not immediately vocalize its eyes moving between the man's hands and his face, in the rapid calculating way of a creature running probabilities. Then the colleague's hand crossed within reach of the wrist, and what happened next was not fear, but something older and faster than fear. A response that came from somewhere beneath decision, the animal's entire body recoiling and striking outward at once, a sound coming from it that was less a scream than a declaration sustained and unambiguous. The colleague withdrew, assessed the marks on his forearm, and left the room without speaking. The keeper stayed in the doorway for a long time. After watching the animal where it had retreated to the highest corner of its enclosure, the wrapped wrist pressed flat against the wall behind it, chest-heaving eyes still tracking the door with the exhausting vigilance of something that has been proven right about the world being dangerous. He turned and walked back down the corridor. The animal was returned to the mountain. 7 days later, the worn medical textile still wrapped around its left wrist. It emerged from the transport carrier at the base of the enclosure and sat very still for a moment at the carrier's mouth, not hesitating exactly, but recalibrating, taking in the changed scale of things, the open air, the smell of stone and other animals, and the faint cold of a winter afternoon. Then it moved, not toward the edges, not toward the sheltered corners where injured animals typically retreat to wait out the unfamiliar, but directly to a ledge on the mid-level face of the mountain in full view of the troop, and sat down facing outward. The left wrist, with its faded fabric, rested across its knee where it could be seen. The keeper stood below and watched, arms loose at his sides, chin tilted up, trying to understand what he was looking at. An animal that should, by every logic of recent trauma and handling, be pressing itself into the smallest available space, but was instead occupying a visible position in the open air and resting the wrapped wrist on its knee in a way that seemed from below less like concealment and more like deliberate placement. That evening, walking back along the service path in the fading light, the keeper turned the image over in his mind and could not set it down. The small figure on the ledge, the angle of the arm, the particular quality of stillness that was not the stillness of fear, but of something with a different intention behind it. And he did not yet know what to do with what he had seen, only that it was asking a question he had not thought to ask. The keeper began arriving earlier. Not by much, 20 minutes, sometimes 30, but enough to be in position below the mountain, before the troop had fully organized itself for the day, while the animals were still moving through the loose, unhurried social sorting that happens in that first hour of morning light, before hierarchy reasserts itself and the day's arrangements solidify. He stood in the same place each time at the base of the northeast face, where a natural depression in the ground gave him a slightly elevated line of sight to the mid-level ledges, and he wore the same light blue denim jacket, the same black rubber boots. He kept his hands consistently at his sides, or tucked into his jacket pockets, because he had learned during the treatment room sessions that hands held in front of the body altered the quality of the animal's attention in ways that were not useful. He was not watching the small monkey. He was watching what happened around the small monkey, a distinction that took nearly 2 weeks to arrive at, and arrived not as a sudden realization, but as an accumulation of mornings in which the same pattern repeated itself with enough consistency that ignoring it would have required a deliberate effort. No animal in the troop made contact with the left wrist. Not during grooming, when the boundaries between bodies become temporarily meaningless, and a hand moves across a shoulder, a back, a forearm, without social calculation. Not even then did any animal reach toward or across the wrapped wrist. Not during feeding competition, when the hierarchy asserted itself physically, and larger animals displaced smaller ones from food sources with shoulder pressure and directed stares. The small monkey was displaced like any animal of its rank. But the left wrist was never the point of contact, never grabbed, never used as leverage. Not during the loose affiliative rest of mid-morning, when animals leaned against each other and draped arms across neighbors and settled into the warm geometry of bodies in proximity, did any animal rest upon or against the wrapped wrist. One particular morning gave a shape to what had until then remained only a pattern. A juvenile male younger than the small monkey lower in the troop's informal rankings had been moving through a series of small provocations since early in the day. The kind of low-stakes testing that young males engage in when the dominant animals are occupied elsewhere, pushing at boundaries that are usually enforced, seeing what holds. He had worked his way along the mid-level ledge with this quality of restless, probing energy, displacing two smaller animals from their resting spots with shoulder pressure, claiming a patch of sunlight that another animal had been occupying, moving with the self-important momentum of a creature trying on authority it has not yet earned. When he reached the small monkey, he paused. The keeper standing below in the pale morning light watched the pause, the juvenile standing very still for a moment close enough that contact was available, his eyes moving from the small monkey's face to its left wrist and back. Then, without making contact, without any of the shoulder pressure or directed stare he had used on every other animal, in the preceding minutes, the juvenile moved around it and continued along the ledge. He did not treat the wrist the way an animal treats an injury, with the cautious, uncertain deference born of not wanting to provoke an unpredictable response. He treated it the way an animal treats something it has already understood, with the clean, economical acknowledgement of a boundary that has been established and does not need to be tested. The keeper stood below the mountain and felt something settle in his understanding with enough weight that he exhaled before the thought had fully completed itself. The small monkey had not been granted this by the troop as a function of sympathy or instinct, had not inherited it. Through weeks of sitting in visible positions with the wrapped wrist facing outward, through the accumulated repetition of occupying space in a particular way, through the quiet and persistent language of a body that had learned to use what it had available, the animal had communicated something to the troop. The troop had received it and integrated it and acted on it in the way that groups of animals act on information that has been clearly enough transmitted. The keeper turned away from the mountain. He walked to the low concrete barrier at the perimeter of the observation area and sat down on it, facing away from the enclosure, his hands resting open on his knees, the pale fabric of the light blue jacket catching the flat winter light. 3 months counting from that first afternoon in the treatment room, from the first wrapping of the wrist, and the first time the animal's breathing slowed when the fabric settled into place. Spent approaching the problem from the wrong direction, treating the medical textile and the psychological structure it had become, as though they were the same problem, as though removing one would resolve the other. The fabric was not a symptom of something that needed correcting. It was a solution to something that needed time. And the only question that had ever mattered, the only one worth asking, was when this animal would decide on its own terms and in its own time that the solution was no longer needed. The keeper sat with his hands open on his knees, watching the shadow of the mountain's parapet move slowly across the ground in front of him, and then stood and walked back to his position at the base of the northeast face and continued watching, not for a problem to solve, but for a readiness to recognize. The morning it happened looked like every other morning. A low winter sky, the kind that holds light without releasing it, diffusing everything to the same flat gray, so that the rock face of the mountain and the pale sky behind it seemed almost continuous, a single surface without depth or boundary. The troop had been awake for an hour by the time the keeper arrived and took his position below the northeast face, long enough for the morning sorting to have concluded and the animals to have settled into the mid-morning arrangement of small clusters and solo positions that would hold until feeding time disrupted it. The keeper stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, chin up, watching the mountain with the same quality of attention he had brought to it every morning for the past several weeks, present to whatever occurred, the same black boots on the same patch of ground, the light blue jacket collar turned up slightly against the cold. The small monkey was on the mid-level ledge toward the center of it, where 2 other animals had settled into the loose, semi-conscious proximity of mid-morning rest. It was not isolated. It was simply there, in the way that members of a stable group are simply present to one another, not in active contact, not at deliberate distance, but sharing space with the unremarkable ease of a creature that belongs where it is. The keeper noticed the movement before he understood what he was seeing. The small monkey looked down at its left wrist, not glancing, but looking with the focused, evaluative stillness that precedes a deliberate action. The head angled slightly, the body otherwise motionless. The eyes moving across the surface of the worn fabric with a quality of attention that was entirely different from anything the keeper had seen this animal bring to that wrist before. Every previous engagement with the wrist had been defensive, a reflexive curl of the arm inward, a pulling away, a guarding. This was not that. This was assessment. The small monkey raised its right hand and took the fraying edge of the medical textile between two fingers. Not pulling, not tearing, but holding it with the light exploratory grip of a creature measuring something before deciding, and looked up. It looked at the animals around it on the ledge. The older male 3 body lengths away continued the slow, methodical search through his own fur that had been occupying him for the past several minutes, unhurried and entirely absorbed in the task. The younger female to the left shifted her weight slightly, resettled her position on the stone, did not look up. Along the upper reaches of the mountain, the ordinary sounds of the morning continued without alteration. Movement and contact, and the occasional brief vocalization, the ambient texture of a group of animals going about the business of existing together. Nothing changed. The small monkey looked back down at its wrist. It pulled slowly with the same evaluative quality as before, feeling the resistance of the fabric, adjusting the angle, slightly pulling again with the patient, methodical attention of a creature that has already made its decision and is simply executing it carefully. The worn textile came free, in a single continuous motion, the way something releases, when it has been loosened gradually, by time and quiet intention together, and fell from the wrist and caught on a rough edge of stone in the narrow crevice, just below the ledge, hanging there for a moment, shifting in the faint air that moved along the rock face, then settling against the stone. The small monkey looked at its bare wrist. The scar tissue there was pale against the surrounding fur, smooth, and slightly raised along its length, the whole record of the wire and the weeks, and the fluorescent-lit mornings in the treatment room, and every morning since, compressed into a few centimeters of changed skin that would not change back. It looked at the wrist for a long time. Then it looked out at the troop. The older male continued his unhurried grooming. The younger female had closed her eyes. Along the upper ledges, 2 animals that had been in a low-grade proximity dispute resolved it. The way these things are usually resolved, one of them simply moved and the matter was over, and neither looked back. The mountain continued its morning. The keeper standing below had stopped breathing at some point during those last few minutes and became aware of it only gradually, as a kind of pressure in the chest that resolved when he finally exhaled slowly, without moving anything else. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his chin tilted up, and watched the small monkey sit with its bare wrist resting on its knee in the open air. The worn textile caught in the crevice below. And he did not speak, and did not move, and did not do anything that might alter the quality of stillness the animal was moving through. The small monkey sat on the ledge for a long time after the fabric fell. It did not look at the crevice where the textile rested. It did not reach for it, did not check on it, did not do any of the things a creature does when it is uncertain about what it has just let go of. It simply sat with the bare wrist visible in the flat winter light, and watched the mountain go about its morning, which for everyone else on that mountain it was. Eventually, the small monkey stood and moved away from the wall and walked into the center of the ledge where the other animals were resting, and settled into the space between 2 of them with the easy, unremarkable confidence of a creature that knows where it belongs. Nothing on the ledge shifted in response to its arrival. The morning continued as mornings do. The gray sky holding its diffuse and even light, the mountain going about its own slow business, the keeper standing below with his hands in his pockets, and the slow, quiet return of his own ordinary breathing. He thought, standing there, that the problem he had spent 3 months trying to solve might not have been his problem to solve at all. That the animal had been working on it the entire time in its own terms, at its own pace. and that what looked from the outside like waiting had been from the inside a long and deliberate movement toward a threshold that only the animal itself could identify and only the animal itself could cross. The textile strip remained in the crevice for several days, visible from below as a small pale interruption in the dark stone. Then it slipped further into the crack an inch one morning, and then gone absorbed into the place where it had landed without ceremony and without announcement, the way small things are absorbed by stone and cold and time. In the weeks that followed, the keeper continued to arrive early and take his position at the base of the northeast face. The small monkey moved through the troop without the wrapped wrist, and the keeper watched for how the troop would respond to the change, whether the invisible boundary around the left arm would hold or dissolve or shift into something else. It held for a time. The careful avoidance of the bare wrist persisted for several weeks, with almost the same consistency as when the fabric had been there, a ghost of the boundary maintained by the same animals who had maintained the original, as though the information that had been transmitted was about the animal itself and not the thing it had been carrying. Then gradually, it began to dissolve, not all at once, but in the incremental, unremarked way that social arrangements change when the circumstances that created them have changed. A little less deference each week, the wrist becoming simply a wrist, the small monkey becoming simply one animal, among others, on the mid-level ledge. The keeper watched this too from his position below the northeast face hands. In his pockets, chin tilted up, the light blue jacket catching whatever light the winter sky offered. There was nothing dramatic in any of it. That was he had come to understand the point that the most significant things in this work rarely announced themselves, rarely arrived with the clarity of a moment that could be pointed to and named, but accumulated instead in the unhurried, unremarkable way that the small monkey had accumulated its own readiness morning by morning until the morning. It was simply enough. By late winter, the small monkey had moved up in its resting position, not dramatically, not in any single visible assertion, but by the gradual, almost geological drift of an animal, finding its level within a group that was itself always slowly rearranging. It spent more mornings on the upper ledges, now among animals that would not have tolerated its proximity during the weeks immediately after it returned from the treatment room. And it moved through those spaces with the unremarkable ease of a creature that had learned the difference between the space it was allowed and the space it could simply occupy. The keeper noticed this too from below. Without marking it as a milestone, it registered the way most significant changes register only in retrospect, only when the distance between where something had been and where it was now became large enough to be visible. There were mornings when the small monkey descended from the mountain entirely and moved along the ground-level perimeter, which required passing close to the area where the keeper stood. And on those mornings, the animal did not accelerate past him or alter the angle of its path, but simply moved at its own pace, at its own distance, with the particular quality of indifference that is not avoidance, but the absence of the need to avoid. The keeper stood still on those mornings and let it pass, hands in his pockets, and did not reach out and did not make a sound. Understanding that what was being offered in those moments, if offered, was even the right word, was not proximity, but coexistence, which was a different thing, and in some ways a harder thing to receive without wanting to turn it into more than it was. Spring came, the way spring comes in that part of the country. Not suddenly, but by accumulation, a degree warmer, each week, the flat winter light gradually acquiring depth and angle. The mountain's gray stone beginning to hold heat by midday in a way it had not done since autumn. The troop responded the way troops do, with an increase in movement, in social interaction, in the low-grade ambient energy of animals, whose world had expanded with the temperature. Within this general opening up, the small monkey expanded too, ranging further along the ledges, engaging in longer grooming exchanges, occupying its days with the ordinary business of a young animal, finding its place within a group that was itself always in the slow process of finding its shape. The keeper watched all of this from the base of the northeast face in the light blue jacket that was now beginning to show the season's wear along the cuffs and collar. And what he watched looked from the outside exactly like nothing. Like an ordinary troop on an ordinary mountain, going through the ordinary adjustments of a season changing, because that was in fact what it was. The thing that had happened here was not visible in any single moment. It was only visible in the distance, between the animal that had screamed when a hand was raised toward it in the gray winter mist, and the animal that now moved along the upper ledges in the thin spring light. Left wrist bare, the scar tissue, there faded now to the color of old stone, indistinguishable at any distance from the rest of the fur. The small monkey had looked at the world without the fabric, had found it unchanged, and walked into it, not because anyone showed it the way, and not because the fear had disappeared, but because it had held still long enough and looked carefully enough to learn in the only way that learning of that kind arrives, that the world it had been afraid of was no longer the world it was living in.